Welcome. This is our third class, our crash course in critical thinking. How do we navigate our post-truth world? I want to welcome everybody, and we have Marla back this week. Yay! Hopefully everybody got a copy of the syllabus. It'll give you what we're going to do tonight, some recommended books, and the key points so you don't have to write them down. And once again, we always want to remind people to take advantage of the first couple of classes worth of material. Maybe you should say something about this, about setting your controls for discovery.
Well, you know, this is a small group we've been together, but just to remember that if anything triggers you, breathe deeply. Getting into our discomfort zone is a zone of growth, and we don't anticipate anything, but you never know, right? And, be in listening mode, not rebuttal mode, kind of the things we've said before. Keep a Zen mind, Zen beginner's mind.
Yeah, and again, as you know, we will, Marla do a section, I'll do a section, and in between after each one, we'll do a kind of a Q&A and discussion. What I loved about this class in particular is the Q&A and discussion kind of blends. It becomes kind of a conversation. And that's nice when we have a small group of people. But again, our subject, critical thinking, just to remind everybody and get us kind of centered on what we're trying to do, is we're trying to learn how to think critically. That is, learn to have objective analysis and evaluation designed to form good judgment. And the root of it is this idea of discernment, to cut between what's true and false, which is really, really difficult to do. And last time I left with this little slide about try not to be for or against things. And what we mean is not so much in terms of morality and issues, because that's important, but in terms of our thinking as we're trying to analyze issues, as we have to really go into discovery mode and be mindful of the fact that we do have this tendency to want to be for and against. We kind of often want to be right. We want to kind of join our team, and that we really need as critical thinkers to avoid that, to not be for or against. And the overarching theme, how do we really know? It's a big problem today in our post-truth world, and we're going to talk next time in our last class a little bit more about what we mean by post-truth world. But for tonight, we're going to focus on how does bias get in the way of clear thinking? How does bias get in the way of us being able to think critically? And in particular, how can social media and news outlets distort our perception of the world? This is a really, really important topic right now. It seems like every week we're hearing more about problems with social media, and particularly the kind of distortion that can take place when we're actively involved in social media and in analyzing things. And I want to remind everybody of one of our facts of life as we enter into this world of kind of bias, and that is that our minds evolve by natural selection. It's really important that we're mindful of that, because our minds our modern skulls house a kind of a Stone Age mind. We kind of carry with us how our minds evolved over millions of years, and that includes this phenomena of my-side bias that we talked about last week. But it also means that we are prone to cognitive errors. Because our minds evolved, we didn't have a kind of a programmer who set up and looked and said, well, this is how a mind should work. It should do this and this. That's how we would, those of us who are kind of analytical and program-oriented, if we were designing a brain, we would do it in such a way that it would make good decisions the way a computer does. Well, the problem is our brains were not designed like that. They were designed by natural selection. That is, the adaptive pressures over millions of years drove us to think the way that we do. And because of that, we're kind of prone to cognitive error. And that's what we're going to focus on tonight. And in particular, the idea of bias. What do we mean by bias? Well, a bias is a preference or an inclination that is mostly unconscious. We all have biases. Most of our biases tend to be below the surface. They're not things that we're aware of, but they come with us. They're part of our evolved mental architecture, you could say, part of what we might call iOS Homo sapien. And unfortunately, it's kind of like Microsoft. It seems like every week there's a new patch, and there's a new patch, and each patch creates another problem. Our minds are just kind of like that. You know, we have to really struggle with an operating system that seems to have a lot of bugs in it. And again, part of the role of learning to be a critical thinker is being able to identify what those bugs are that are in the system so that we can see clearly and have a better, more objective understanding of the world around us. And again, what we mean by a bias, this idea of a bias, it's the idea of moving towards something or favoring something that's going in a particular direction. And unless you stop it, unless you're mindful, you know, it's kind of like if you have a car that gets out of alignment and it's going to the right, it's going to the right. That's a bias to the right. Unless you are conscious and you shift it over, you're going to go right into the ditch. And thinking is the same way. Unless we're conscious of what these errors are and we work to correct them, we're going to constantly fall into the problems of misunderstanding the world as opposed to understanding the world. So what we're going to do tonight, Marla's going to come and talk about cognitive errors, how our minds play tricks on us. Then we'll do some Q&A and maybe have a little discussion about that material. Then we'll take a break and we come back. I'm going to talk about what I call signal and noise. We're going to look a little bit at mass media and the effect that it has on us. How are we being manipulated by mass media? So that's what we're going to do tonight.
Okay, so I missed you all last week, but I know Rob did a great job channeling me. And I'm gonna continue with, you know, what gets in the way of critical thinking and good thinking. And as we started in the first class, we're making a map, right? We talked about triggering and defenses the first night. We talked about, or Rob talked about, you know, our defenses against being wrong, needing to be right. And tonight it's about how our minds play tricks on us, about our biases. And there's a slide we found by social scientists who came up with 188 ways, specific ways that our minds play tricks on us. And we'll go through almost all of them tonight now.
And there'll be a test. It'll be multiple choice.
For you high achievers. But just to say, and for me it's helpful to always realize I could have a bias running, you know, to be able to check in with myself and just maybe at least wait to have an opinion about something. We want to start with a clip. This is from Heterodox Academy. I've shown it so many times, I'm having this deja vu. But this is about colleges, all right? It's Jonathan Haidt, whose work we go on a lot. He's one of the first bridgers. He started an organization in the for academia because there's so much left-leaning bias on campus these days. And so even though he's talking about colleges here, it really applies to all of us.
What is reason? Philosophers have long told us it is humanity's highest and noblest attribute. It's what separates us from other animals. It's what allows us to separate truth from falsehood. There's just one problem. When psychologists study real people trying to reason, what they find is that reason has a gigantic, crippling flaw. It's called the confirmation bias. People don't use their reasoning abilities to find the truth. They use reason to confirm the views that they already hold. Now put people into teams where everyone holds the same beliefs, and the confirmation bias grows into a collective mania. Everyone helps everyone else find reasons why their side is right, further deepening shared bonds. Heaven help any individual who thinks for herself or who looks for evidence on the other side. Such people are called traitors, and groups have many ways of shutting them up. When everyone's beliefs line up, and when dissenters are punished, that's the definition of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy can be great if you're heading into battle and you want everyone marching in lockstep. But what if your goal is truth rather than victory? What if you actually wanted to help students overcome their confirmation bias and learn about the perspectives of others? What if you wanted to create a community of researchers who could actually study and solve social problems? In other words, what if you wanted to create a university? Would you want orthodoxy? Or would you want its opposite, heterodoxy, where multiple views are not just permitted but encouraged? In a heterodox university, each person can still use their reasoning powers to find reasons why they are right and others are wrong. But here's the brilliant thing. Each person becomes the solution to someone else's confirmation bias. This is why universities must have viewpoint diversity. Viewpoint diversity is the only reliable way to get around confirmation bias. Viewpoint diversity is the secret to a great education. It may not always be comfortable, but when ideas collide, we learn, we grow together. Everyone gets smarter. The alternative? Campuses that try to protect students from unapproved ideas, books, and speakers. A politically orthodox university discourages dissent, creativity, empathy, and truthfulness. That's why more than 1,000 academics from across the political spectrum have joined Heterodox Academy. Working with students, professors, and administrators, Heterodox Academy is rebuilding the culture of free inquiry and open, civil debate that turns universities into engines of discovery, growth, and progress. Support free inquiry. Share your voice. Stand up for viewpoint diversity.
So just on that note, we are doing a talk on Tuesday at SOU. The Democrat and Republican clubs jointly are sponsoring us about free speech on campus. So we're going to go into what this clip is pointing to if you're interested. So there's a parable about the six blind men and the elephant. So some of you have heard it, but I'll say it again for the camera. Six blind men were asked to define an elephant. They each grabbed a part, one the trunk, one the tail, one the foot, and they could only describe it by the part that they had gotten a hold of. And we are all the blind men. We can only grasp the part of reality that we can see. That's why we really need viewpoint diversity. And like it said on the clip, viewpoint diversity is the only way to counter confirmation bias. And we all have confirmation bias. It's wired. So also the other thing about viewpoint diversity is that it's not enough just to be exposed to ideas, but to put ourselves in a frame of mind where we could actually consider ideas. So some of that, looking at our triggering, looking at the way our mind plays tricks on us, needing to be right, all of that gives us more chance to really consider the other idea and see what's valid about that. There's a writer, Alan Jacobs, who, they have the book here called How to Think, really good, not very long. He's a really smart writer and gets to the point really quickly. And he says that he takes issue with the phrase to think for yourself. He says we can't really think, at least by ourselves. We need others. He calls them like-hearted others instead of like-minded others, willing to come together to share ideas, to get a closer look at what the truth might be. My friend Greg always says it's the easiest thing in the world to have an opinion. And what we've noticed and what I've noticed in myself, and I catch myself all the time, is when I'm positing an opinion as a fact. And the Pew Research team that is very well reputed, they did a study about, you can go online if you go to Pew Fact versus Opinion. It's a 10-question thing. It takes you 2 minutes. And they gauge whether people can tell the difference between fact and opinion. They found that only about 30% got them all right. So it's really interesting. The other thing that gets in the way of thinking clearly is something we've talked about, but I want to talk about it again, this cognitive dissonance, which is what I call wobbliness. It's when I'm hearing something, and I'll give examples, because when I first got together with Rob, he would send me articles that were really, not purposefully, but they were really challenging to what I already believed was true. I think much differently now, but I'd see the headlines and I'd start shaking. And I just couldn't look at it. And there was the idea that X could be true shook me up so much. And I think, like we saw last week probably, that when we hear something that shakes up our worldview, it can shake up everything. If we're wrong about this, what if I'm wrong about everything? So, and I can see sometimes when we're giving talks, I can see people as that's what they're doing. They'll go like this, their eyes will get glazed, and I see they've checked out because it's really feels threatening. So, again, like we've talked about before, it's really necessary to see what's happening and kind of self-regulate. Like, okay, I know this is what's happening. No one's got a knife to my throat. I'll just calm down here. So, cognitive biases, sometimes they're right on. And our brains have evolved so that we make shortcuts. So every time you're encountering one thing, you don't have to rethink the wheel every time. So sometimes they're accurate, but they're all basically shortcuts. And they create blind spots. And like Rob was saying before, it needs a manual override, catching ourselves in the act. Sometimes it's helpful to have others, like others who love us, help us see that too, right? I know that's been really, really helpful for me. So I want to talk about this idea of confirmation and disconfirmation bias. We had in one of our, so confirmation bias is, accepting and embracing ideas that support what we believe, but disconfirmation bias is like what I did with the headlines, like pushing away anything that rubs up against what we believe. And we had a judge in one of our classes who said, I can't tell you how many times jurors had already decided before they listened to the evidence. And it really, even though I kind of knew that intuitively, it was shocking to hear it from somebody who was in the field and knew. And he said the confirmation bias was so strong because most of us don't know that we think that's our reality. We think that's objective reality. Ken Stern, who wrote the book Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. Now, he stayed a progressive, but he could look through both lenses, and really, it's an excellent book. He said the strongest bias in American politics is not a liberal bias or a conservative bias, it's a confirmation bias, or the urge to believe only things that confirm what you already believe to be true. A personal example is years ago, do you guys know who Bill Nye, the science guy, is? So he had been anti-GMO, and then at one point he was pro-GMO. And my middle son and I, when we heard that, we both looked at each other and said, oh, Monsanto must have paid him off. But that is contempt prior to investigation. I didn't get curious to say, oh, I wonder what his thinking was, or, it was none of that. It was just dismissive. Before checking it out for myself. Rob and I met several months ago with one of Jonathan Haidt's colleagues, which was a really exciting thing. And so we were talking, she was giving us tips, and she suggested that when there was somebody in the room who really was pushing back against an idea, the disconfirmation bias way, she said, ask them, so what would it mean to you if X were really true? And I think that's a really good question to ask ourselves. Like, what, if this headline that Rob sent me were really true, what would it mean to me? It would have shattered not only this, this particular, it happened to be about GMOs, I think even, but it would have shaken up everything. Again, if I was wrong about that, what if I was wrong about everything? And I was so much with the ideology of my party that I just never questioned anything. The other thing I want to talk about are double standards. And there's a few things that come up. Recently I read a research paper about that voters judged the transgressions, the moral transgressions of someone from another party much more than they did their own, right? That seems kind of intuitively true, right? One of the things that happened to me is I showed, does anybody here know the movie The Red Pill? It's a couple years old. It's a documentary about the men's rights movement. And the woman who filmed it, the documentarian, she had started out as a really committed feminist, and she was going to expose the men's rights movement. What she found was not so clear. She saw the other side of the story. And for me, it was an important thing to, especially in a world where men are pointed out and saying, oh, well, they're part of the patriarchy, to see really what some of the downsides of being a man are. So I showed it at I was afraid. We eventually showed it in public, but I was really afraid because I was pretty sure I was going to get pushback. So I just showed it in 5 different salons at my house, maybe 8 women each. And some of the feedback I got was that the film was biased. And I said, well, first of all, most documentaries are biased. You know, they might, the good ones will at least show the other point of view, but most of them don't. I said, and I'll go back to GMO. I said, so say, for instance, you were anti-GMO and you saw an anti-GMO documentary and they didn't tell anything about what could be right about GMOs, would you say that's a biased film? Right? So there's another double standard there. The other one that happened to us, somebody came to me at a break of one of the talks and she says, don't you think it's terrible that the NRA, they give money to politicians, you know, don't you think they should be stopped? There should be a law. And I said, well, what do you think about climate change activists doing the same? She said, well, that's fine. And I said, well, why? She says, because they're right. And I just said, it's a slippery slope, ma'am. You know, we really have to watch out. But I think every time, I've been doing this a couple of years now, that I catch myself in something that kind of loosens my grip on the sense that I see reality accurately. And it also makes me feel okay to not have an opinion. That wobbliness, I'm not very wobbly anymore. If I am anymore, it kind of feels like, oh, it's kind of a good thing, because I know I'm loosening something. But it does take, it's a practice. The other thing I want to point out is perspective. So I call this, it all depends where you sit. And I think part of really being able to think critically is to want to see what another person sees. You know, just kind of, can I put themselves in their reality for a minute just to understand where they've come up with an idea that might be counter to mine. So I have a few examples here. So I had a friend who was quite liberal, and she then became a landlord. This changed everything for her because of some of the rental laws she could see were really harsh on her, especially now with the rent control thing. So it's like, and I think what we tend to do, this is this splitting, this black and white thinking, that one side's right and the other side's wrong, instead of, yes, there's something to be said about some protection for renters, but also there's like an economic reality for landlords, instead of saying, oh, they just are capitalists, greedy capitalists. You know, sometimes they have reparations on old buildings. It's not a matter of, it's not black and white. So I think when I find myself one-sided, can I step over and see what might be the point of view from somebody else? And I know that's happened with people who become like shop owners or business owners after having not been that. It's like, wow, there's payroll taxes and reports and all these things that are a real burden on businesses. The other example I have is wolves' rights activists, for example, who have been very negative towards ranchers who would shoot wolves. And a friend of mine was in that boat and, you know, was very down on ranchers until she kind of had the aha that, oh, the wolves were killing their livestock, their way of living, their livelihood. And I know what they've done in a few places now is they've gotten together, the two groups, to find humane ways to block the wolves, right? And that's what we need to do more and more with these problem solvings. How can more of the concerns of both stakeholders be addressed? Another situation I had was, I lived in France for 15, 16 years, some of you know that. And when I moved here, somebody said, oh, it must have been fabulous to live in a socialist country. And I said, well, depends where you're sitting. I said, we had small businesses, and it was very expensive, first of all, with taxes, both personal and business. That's one thing, which made it also hard for entrepreneurs. But we had, for example, a manager who was very racist to the kitchen, which were mostly guys from Africa. And he would really misspeak to them. He was mean to them. And we'd say, Mark, you've got to, you know, this has to change. And he just couldn't change. But by law back then, and it may well have changed by now, so this is 25 years ago, we couldn't fire him legally. So we had to pay him off to leave, which wasn't tax deductible. And Just saying. So I think in learning to think critically, if we can step in as much different facets of the issue, the better. The better able we are going to be able to make a proper assessment. So I want to show you now a short clip about something called the attribution error. It's just another bias.
Today we are going to talk about the fundamental attribution error. What exactly is the fundamental attribution error, and why is it so important? Let's look at an example. Say your friend Bob takes you to a party, and at that party he introduces you to his other friend Eric. Eric is particularly curt and seems uninterested in meeting you. He comes off as unfriendly. Chances are your first reaction is to assume Eric is just an unfriendly person. A real jerk, if you will, right? Well, what if Eric is just having a really tough day? Maybe he broke up with his girlfriend, or maybe someone close to him has passed away. Then you may think Eric's behavior is excusable because, well, he's just having a bad day. I guess Eric isn't that bad a guy, huh? Well, this mix-up in judgment is a perfect example of the fundamental attribution error. In other words, people tend to place more emphasis on internal explanations rather than considering the circumstances. So next time you meet someone at a party, don't be so quick to judge them.
Another example that's used a lot in showing this is that and maybe this has happened to you, I know it's happened to me, where you'll pull up to a parking space and you'll see someone who's taken 2 spaces and you go, what a jerk. I go, what a jerk. And then, the story is if you rolled back time an hour, it could be 2 cars who had parked, so that's the only place that person could park. So part of the thing that they think they could have highlighted more here is that we tend to judge others like that by smearing their character versus what circumstances could he or she have been in. And a friend of mine has something called the rule of 6. She says whenever something happens and she's judging or taking somebody's behavior badly, she makes up 6 reasons why they might be the way they are, whatever happened there, and usually it's not even on that list. So because we other people become like Rorschach tests for us. We're just projecting or imagining or assuming, and we don't have a way of knowing. So again, these ways we have of catching to be able to say, I don't know, maybe this guy's having a bad day. It really, what I'm feeling as I'm talking about all this is the spaciousness that we start getting inside when we don't have all this software running. So, where am I? Okay, so as I like to do, we're going to do a little exercise. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can pair up. I also like to give the people the option to journal if they want.
Ari, you want to journal?
Ari probably will have to journal.
I can journal.
Okay, your face is frozen, which is...
I thought I was frozen.
Yeah, you're frozen. It's like kind of driving me crazy. Okay. So here's the exercise. So it's going to be a 5-minute monologue where one person speaks for 5 minutes and one person listens. So it's not a conversation. Why that is so the person can really delve deep. If I'm involved with David and trying to answer him and think about what I want to say, it really it's another thing. It's a conversation, not a focusing in. So the options are you can talk about any of these, all of these, or something else that's come up from what we've said so far that's you've realized about yourself. So to see where these errors show up in your life or have shown up in your life. Confirmation and disconfirmation, so accepting or rejecting information automatically because it contradicts your pre-existing beliefs, or on the contrary, holding on to things that because they go along with what you already believe. Double standards, like I said, it's okay, it's good or okay for me, but not for the other person. Perspective, putting yourself in another situation, and then this final attribution error. So, and then once you get paired up, we will time it and tell you when to switch. So are there any questions, first of all? Okay, does anybody not want to be in a, does anybody want to journal?
How much time?
5 minutes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So Nikki, you make a 7, so do you mind not being, okay, so partner up. Do you guys want to stay together, the couples, or you want to branch out? Robin and Jeff, you want to stay together, or you want to break it up? You guys decide.
Okay, staying together.
Okay. Oh, I'm so glad.
We have to decide though on the topics.
Yeah, you can address all of them. One of them, like I said, something else might be coming up for you. And so all you have to do right now is decide who goes first. So again, it's not a conversation. Just listen to your speaker. Okay, is everybody ready? Okay.
Just discussing this sort of in general, or are we trying to pick a topic?
No, well, you could take one of those. I think examples work really well to say, oh, I noticed
All the
that
stuff that we've
the
been-
other day I had a double standard. You know, yeah, good.
And then the next person just takes their turn, we don't respond after.
Right.
5
so
minutes each.
Just
We're going to do
5
5
minutes
minutes, and then we'll stop, and then the other person will do 5
Yeah.
minutes.
Okay.
And here we go.
Okay, finish your thought and then switch roles. And you can start. Okay, finish your thought. So, would anyone like to share anything? Like, especially an aha or an insight or something you didn't realize about yourself? And Ari, you're included. Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, Linda.
It's not really an insight, but I realized when we were talking about the attribution of attaching erroneous explanations to somebody else's behavior or situation or whatever, that the more I know about another group, the more I don't have like one answer of, oh, they're probably that way because of X.
Mm-hmm.
But, oh, they could be that way because of X or Y or Q, or so I can't really make a judgment about them because I don't know enough about them per se.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So perhaps
Yeah.
the more information we have, the more we won't do that.
Right. And sometimes asking
Mhm.
if it's appropriate. Yeah. Thank you. Lori?
There were two topics that we both were interested in talked about. One was forest management, and the other was left and right,
Mm-hmm.
and the media. And it turns out we both watch both. But what I was able to, as I talked it through, it got clearer that what I find difficult, what I'll turn off either the left or the right, is when they start to get disparaging.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get disparaging, you're starting to hook, and I can feel it's a palpable feeling. You're starting to hook your emotional body.
Right.
And when you that gets hooked and you start to get pulled into and identified, when I feel that in myself with the emotion, I can actually feel my brain shut down.
Yeah.
And you get pulled into a colored vacuum.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and I know the brain. I teach about brain function.
Right.
And as I can really feel it happen in my own brain.
Yep.
And that's when I get the clicker and or the dial and say, But I see that as a business out there. It's for money. It's for, you should say, entertainment. But it's not entertainment. It's actually a money-making marketing ploy to hook people's emotions. I watched my father go down that from a broad-minded a Democrat for most of his life, and he just followed Rush Limbaugh down this rabbit hole and became angry and obsessive about it. And I couldn't talk. Finally, had to say, "We're not talking about this. And if you bring it up, I will get up and walk out." And it was the only way to contain it. And so this is something that's happening on the left and the right.
Yeah.
And it's a money-making operation, and who knows, if there's any other agenda behind that. Money alone is a motivation for people to do this.
Right. Oh, and there's a new book coming out called Hate Inc. by Matt Taibbi, who's
Matt Taibbi, who's a kind of a journalist on the left, and yet very critical of what this emerging left-wing media, which we're going to talk about in the second half.
Yeah. Thanks.
It's interesting what you say, because it gets back to our first class. We talked a little bit about the brain. Our moral outrage, when we feel moral outrage, that's the older, more parts of the brain that are very deep, and they're basic, and they override everything else. And which is why when we take issues, and again, it's important that we take a moral stand, but we have to be able to look at facts first, and that requires moving out of those areas into the more.
We actually have to question and test our morals, because
Totally.
so many is what something
That's
I've
it, yeah,
shared
that's what we were saying, yeah.
is our very morals. If we don't know the origin of them and we don't test them, we may have just sponged up someone else's story, and we're defending those morals as universal, and they're not.
Hold that thought, because we're going to talk about that a little bit in the second half.
Great. Ari, you want to say anything? Oh, you're frozen again. Oh, well.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Do you want to share anything?
It's so hard. My only insight, I think, was, and sorry if someone said this is a little hard to hear from the audience, but I mean, I think my insight is, one thing that makes the attribution error maybe more complex and more damaging is that these other three that you have listed are sort of these biases of of just this cognitive information gathering, but the attribution error adds a whole extra set of empathy, which is hard enough in and of itself to do without any bias. So I think that was my insight, and that was really the one I thought about the most. And I think I don't know. I guess it just seems I don't know. That was the one that caught me the most in terms of just something that I think can fundamentally alter how people try to treat each other.
Hence the fundamental
Right.
attribution. You're right. It's a good point. It really is one of the most fundamental.
And what I invite you all to do is from tonight till next week when we meet again, see how some of these things might be showing up. See if you can catch yourself, and it'll be interesting if you feel like sharing when you're here next week. It'd be good. Yeah, David.
So we normally think of Asperger's syndrome as being a problem with the brain. It's not functioning right. But those people who have that situation tend to be less controlled by the mammalian brain and much more in terms of just intellect. So is it a higher level of functioning or not?
Well, look at people like Isaac Newton, who many believe was on that spectrum. I've got a son who's autistic. He's not Asperger's, but yeah, difference. Those different ways of brain expression, can seed really interesting developments. And yeah, you think of what we now know as Asperger's, and they've divided it now, I believe, Asperger's and autism into two different camps, because they really do seem to be two different camps. And some of the most amazing people that have contributed to humanity, particularly in the sciences, have kind of been on that spectrum, yeah, because they can block out. So that's a really good point, yeah.
Yeah, Jeff?
It would be reasonable to assume that if we went back 1 million or 2 million years, there were probably a bunch of early humans sitting around the campfire saying, Bill seems to be a little bit different than working different. And you get enough of those people who help us make a shift forward. Who knows, maybe Asperger's is an evolutionary advantage, and come 1,000 years from now, we'll all be acting like that.
Yeah. I tend to, we do a thing where we look at people who you could technically say are outliers, on the spectrum. Even people, you could say people who are transgendered and what have you, they're outliers. I call them the exceptionals, because sometimes those people provide us with just these really amazing differences. They add some real color and to the world. Asperger's is a great example because you really see that. But we really need to appreciate the people who don't fit the norm, the 0.7% or whatever it is, that they really make the tapestry. And of course, I'm biased because I've got a son with autism who just is different, and I kind of grew up with that. And but you really learn to appreciate those people. And yeah, some of them, sadly, probably 1 million years ago, probably a lot of those folks were not treated very well. And
Even really years ago. But I have exposure to the Hawaiian culture, and people who are Hawaiian, people who were, the term was mahu. If you're bisexual or homosexual, or if you're different in that way,
yeah.
They were honored.
Yeah.
They were special people,
Yeah.
and
Exceptional.
Often they were the kumus, the teachers. So the culture, I think, makes a huge difference. Culture shapes our perception.
And we've talked about this because some of us have a background in Christianity, and there are lots of really great things I would say about Christianity, but one of the downsides of religions like Christianity is they do really marginalize and punish people that we now recognize were just expressing who they were naturally as God made them. And that's a hard thing. And so some of that, I think, comes from the need to bind groups together. Morality binds people together, and it blinds them too. When you bind a group of people together around ideas, that helps to be able to have the kind of cohesiveness that you need to compete with other groups. But the downside is it blinds them to the fact that they are bound together with a certain kind of set of ideas that may not be, in fact, true or add up. So it does a lot of damage as well.
Jeff, you had a question.
I was reminded of last week's class where we talked about people that are different than us, and that we tend to assume they are either stupid or ignorant or evil. And I think that is the attribution piece there. We attribute one of those qualities to them. And I think that it's easy. I think Rush Limbaugh and the people like him tend to use the ignorant, stupid, or evil application very quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to break now.
Doing this work a couple, 3 years ago, this is one of the handful of things that I really changed my mind about. I really did not know to the extent to which our media was biased in lots of different ways. So this has been a real aha to me. And again, getting us back centered on what we're trying to do, we're concerned about objective analysis and evaluation. And we're kind of moving a little bit from how our minds work to how we interact with what's coming in at us now. What's the media doing to us? And I use this idea of separating the signal from the noise because, of course, out in the mainstream of the media world. And when I mean by media, I mean the television news, the programming, the documentaries, the newspapers, the magazines, the social media, that whole world out there that's feeding us information about how we're supposed to think of the world. There's a lot of noise out there. In fact, most of it, the overwhelming majority of it, is noise. And how do we separate the signal, what's really important, what's going to help inform us from all the noise? That's what I want to talk about for the next 25 minutes or so. And the biggest source of noise right now, I would say, is this. It's this partisan media. Our media today, in the same way that our culture has gotten increasingly partisan over the last 20 to 30 years, and we talk about this in our classes and talks that we do on Bridging the Divide, our media reflects the same kind of bias. In the 1960s and 70s, when I was growing up, we had the 3 networks that gave us the network news. Most towns had a Democrat paper and a Republican paper, and so there was a kind of a mix of information. There was a sense in which you weren't just getting kind of a partisan view, and that's all changed. And it's all changed recently, particularly since the 1980s. And we have a situation today where our cable news especially kind of mirrors that. These are the 2 most popular cable news and information programs on today. On the left, you have Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, and on the right, you have Sean Hannity, who's on the right. And I don't know if we've shown you, but there's we haven't shown them this.
No.
There was a study that came out in the fall called the Hidden Tribes Study. Really great group. They're actually out of the UK, did a really in-depth, interesting analysis of the partisan landscape in America, kind of from left to right. And there are limitations with looking at it from left to right. And what they figured out was that most people are kind of in the middle. But there are these extremes way on the ends of each side. On the left, it's about 8% of the population are really, really on the left politically. And on the right, it's about 6% of the population that's really, really, on the right. I mean, these are the diehard people that make lots of noise about politics. But they're the ones that tend to get a lot of attention, and they have a big influence on the vast majority of people who are in the middle. And the great aha that I've had, certainly, is that our media tends to reflect these kinds of extremes. And we should kind of expect that in light of what we were talking about last week, this whole idea of my side bias, that our reasoning really evolved to help us make arguments and to prove our points with others, to kind of help us in our social environment. That reasoning is about being right. This whole idea of confirmation bias, all of that this is a feature of our operating system. So it shouldn't surprise us that in an age where there's lots of freedom in the press, that we see this same kind of reality. And just so you know, we did a whole talk on fake news and media bias. How do we get the politics out of journalism? And where we got into this with with a lot more depth, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a sampling of some of the things that we talked about. But if you're interested in knowing more, I'd encourage you to go to our bridging.live and take a look at the talk, because we think it, again, it lays it out more clearly. And to answer this question, how do we get the politics out of journalism? The answer we gave was really straight, and that is, you can't. We can't really take the politics out of journalism. But what we can do is learn to become critical thinkers. And I think that begins with an acknowledgement of kind of what the media map looks like in terms of who's on the left and who's on the right. And I've got a chart that I put together. And this is based on a number of sources. This is work that I've done. I used to have a chart that I used that I got online from some group that does this. And but I've taken a number of sources, one of which is a wonderful book with a kind of misleading title. It's called Left Turn: How Liberal Media Bias Distorts the American Mind. Because that's not the whole story, because there's also a right-wing bias too. But here's the thing. Most people acknowledge right-wing conservative outlets. Most people know that Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, and these kinds of, if you look at this map, Forbes, the New York Post, the Washington Examiner, you read stuff from the Cato, and most people know Breitbart, the Blaze, the Drudge Report. Most people know Fox News is on the right. Although I have to say, Fox News today is much more balanced than it was several years ago. In fact, it's much more balanced than CNN and MSNBC on the left. What most people don't realize is that all of these companies, all of these media outlets, including the major mainstream ones, tend to lean left. And it's become even more so and more obvious in the age of Donald Trump. You have the New York Times and CNN and NBC have pretty much gone on record as saying they are part of the resistance. And if you have the editorial board of the New York Times as part of the anti-Trump resistance, it kind of makes you wonder, how does that affect their news coverage? Well, the answer is it does affect the news coverage. And so this is kind of an outline of where we are, and it's kind of important to recognize, not to take a side. You may be on the left. You may like Mother Jones and Salon and Slate and these kinds of outlets, but recognize that they are giving you a perspective from the left in the same way that Breitbart and Red State and the Blaze are giving you a perspective from the right. Something else that's important to understand is that outlets like HBO are also giving you a perspective from the left. HBO has several political kinds of shows on. Every single one of them is giving you a perspective, not just from the left, but most of them from the very far left. There's one show on, I forget what it's called, the podcast, I forget the name of it, but it's actually a group of President Obama's former staffers, 4 of them. And they're sitting there talking about all the issues of the day on HBO, but they never have a conservative there. Bill Maher rarely has a conservative, although to his credit, he has done a good job of bringing some other voices on. Mainstream media very much leans left today, and they will tend to drive the perspective of the left. Not only HBO, Netflix does the same thing. Facebook and Google and Twitter, they all tend to lean very, very left. There was a video that circulated shortly after the election that showed all the leadership team at Google at a town hall, I think it was a day or two after the 2016 election, consoling the company because Hillary Clinton had lost. Members of, the gal who runs YouTube was a fierce proponent of Hillary Clinton's campaign. The point being, that's going to have some kind of effect on how they deal with issues. So you'll hear reports about conservatives complaining about conservative videos being banned on YouTube. There's a little bit of truth in that. Now, granted, conservative media is going to blow it out of proportion, just like folks on the left tend to blow things out of proportion. But bear in mind, there is this kind of leftward tilt to the media. So if you're like my dad and you watch MSNBC all day long, he's just enraged about the Mueller report. But if he turned on Fox, he would get the other side and he would say, there's more to it than this, because you're going to get a different kind of perspective from Fox News. And this is not something that we just discovered. This is a book that came out in the late 90s by Bernard Goldberg, and I read this when I was preparing to do the fake news talk that we did. And I was very skeptical because I knew that Bernie Goldberg is a regular contributor on Fox News, so I'm immediately going, okay, I'm going to put my skeptic glasses on to read it. But he did a wonderful job in this book of exposing how much the mainstream media really does go to the left. And this is something that he complained about in the 1980s and 90s. He was a correspondent for CBS. He was one of Dan Rather's main correspondents when Dan Rather was doing the news on CBS. And he complained and he complained. Nobody would listen to him. He gave examples, story after story, of how they were tilting the news in one direction. One of the things he points out is the role of activist groups to push the media narrative, something that we saw with the release of Hillary Clinton's emails over the 2016 election. If you read them, that journalists were getting input from people within the DNC, members of the Washington Post and the New York Times. So there's a kind of it's something that you have to be aware of, when you're listening to the news. But Bernie Goldberg, he famously he wrote an op-ed finally for the Wall Street Journal in, I think, 1996 or 1997, talking about this problem of liberal media bias. And Dan Rather never talked to him ever again. He lost his career because all he said was, we need more viewpoint diversity in our newsrooms. Because his point is that this bias that he was talking about is the result of how they see the world. That people who work in media all tend to be the same kind of people. They come from the same kind of backgrounds. They go to the same kinds of schools. They tend to think a lot. There's a kind of groupthink that enters into it. He says a fish doesn't know that it's wet. And this is a phenomenon that began in the 1970s, in the post-Watergate era. And again, a great book that points this out is this book, Left Turn, How Liberal Media Bias Distorts the American Mind. And again, it's not to say that it's just liberal, the left-leaning kind of media. And again, this is because fundamentally of the confirmation bias. One of the questions that people who study this do when they go into newsrooms is they ask them, who's your conservative? Who's your conservative? And most of the time they don't know people do not have any idea who might, because everybody seems to be pretty much on the left. And similarly, you can go into right-wing outlets and you can ask the question, well, who here is more of a progressive? You need to have both in that kind of environment. And again, you have to ask yourself, well, what kind of people become journalists? Think about the kind of people somebody wants to become a journalist as opposed to become a doctor or become, go into the army or whatever. What kind of people become journalists? What personality kinds of attributes, people who become journalists? Well, I would say it's people like Christopher Hitchens. How many know Christopher Hitchens? I'm surprised that people don't know him so much. But he's kind of the journalist's journalist. If you talk to somebody who's a hardcore journalist, he's one of their heroes. And of course, Hitchens' hero was George Orwell, one of the great people to what? To critique society. What is it that journalists do? They tend to be people who are really good at critiquing society. Lori talked about moral values. When we do our talks on Bridging the Divide, we look at the different personality mixes and moral values of people on the left versus the people on the right. And one of the things that we show is that there are real differences between people who lean left and lean right. People on the left tend to be people who are what's called open to experience. They have a lot of openness in their personality. These are people who seek out new experiences. These are people who are curious, creative, artsy, unconventional in their beliefs. People who dislike authority. They dislike structure. They dislike traditional norms. These are people who are less fearful. They get excited about new kinds of things. Again, this is a personality metric that can be studied. And people who lean left tend to be very high on openness. The other thing is, when you look at moral values, the kind of moral instincts that people have, people on the left tend to focus on care and fairness, as opposed to loyalty, authority, and sanctity, which are things that people on the right care more about. People on the right care a lot about authority, the importance of authority. Think about the immigration debate. People on the right are really concerned about the fact that we have borders. We have to have a border. We have to have people obeying the laws and whatnot. People on the left, they're more concerned about the care of victims. They're concerned about the care of people who are being murdered down in Guatemala and all these places down there. They're concerned about fairness. It's not fair that we have all the luxuries of America. These people have nothing. The people on the left have more empathy in that sense. Well, what kind of people become journalists? People who become journalists tend to be people who care about victims. They like to speak truth to power. Right? That's one of the big memes of a journalist. These are not people who like authority. If you had a journalist who liked authority, they're not the kind of person who would go after corruption in town hall. They're not the people who would call to account the people that have the power. So there's a kind of personality that goes into the field of journalism. And it's interesting when we were looking at the Heterodox Academy video. The point of the Heterodox Academy is to counter this problem in our universities, where our universities, much like our mainstream media, leans really, really left. And when you look at journalism departments, there is an overwhelming number of people on the left in journalism departments. One study we looked at, there was an effective 108-to-0 ratio between Democrats and Republicans. So you're getting a real skewed angle on people in journalism school. So these are the kinds of people that become journalists. And if you want further proof of this, this is a figure from the Center for Public Integrity. They're one of a really well-respected group that monitors corruption in our elections. They've won a Pulitzer Prize. And they looked at the contributions in the 2016 election. And these are campaign contributions made by 430 journalists, reporters, news editors, and television news anchors. These are the upper echelon of, these are the elite media people, the kind of people who have the kind of money to give to a presidential campaign, not the people who work at KDRV, who don't make very much money. And what they found was that 96% of these people gave to Hillary Clinton and 4% gave to Donald Trump. And it's a similar figure when you go back and look at the Obama 2012 campaign and the 2008 Obama. You go all the way back, you get similar kinds of numbers. There are in journalism today, broadly speaking, about 90% plus of the journalists who are working in the area of politics are reliable Democrats. When you zoom out and you look at the entirety of the journalism world, people who do the weather and do sports, it's more like 80%. But there is a huge skew to the left amongst journalists today. And it's something to be aware of when you watch the news. Now, I should say that's changing because conservative media, there's a lot of money going into conservative media. So conservative media is on the move, so that will change. But be aware of this dynamic as you're taking in news. And if you're listening to stations that are on the left, make sure that you're aware of that and maybe take in information from the other side. And again, learn to separate the signal from the noise. I had that coffee. I'm really tired because we did a talk today, and I just said, whenever I have coffee, I get this thing where I run out of breath when I can't talk. So again, and if you're interested in knowing more about that, that can be a controversial claim. And we did this talk up in Eagle Point in February. We had a guy who was the editor of the local Upper Rogue Valley newspaper came, and he was really angry about the material as I presented it. And and I asked him, well, where do you sit on the he kind of laid out where he was, and sure enough, he was on the left and what have you. So people get really upset about this, but I think if you do a deep dive and study it out, it's pretty clear that this is what's going on. So I want to talk about a couple more things while we have time. 2 ways in which you really see this. I want to demonstrate a little bit how this works, and I'm going to do that by looking at 2 other biases. One is called the framing bias, and the other is the availability bias. The first is what's called the framing bias, and that is people react to information in different ways depending on how it's presented to them. It's the idea of framing. How do you frame an issue? What kind of language do you use? This is a perennial problem with polls. How do you phrase the question? Well, how you frame an issue, how you frame an event can give people 2 different or 3 or 4 different ways of seeing it. Why? Well, because people react differently to information depending on how it's presented to them. And again, this has to do with the point of view. When somebody's doing a story, when a documentarian is doing a documentary, what's the point of view? Who is he interviewing? Who is he talking to? Are there lots of points of views being expressed, or is it just one? What's left out? What's left on the cutting floor? What's being framed and what have you? And again, you see this with this left to right divide. I noted that folks on the left tend to focus very much on care and fairness. They're very concerned about victims. Think about Kate Brown and her agenda, very much concerned about people who are victimized, whether it's homeless people or people being thrown out of their houses because of rent increases and what have you. And folks on the right, on the other hand, they put a lot of value in care and fairness, but they also value loyalty and authority and sanctity. They're very concerned about the law. Folks on the right, much more concerned about this. So when you look at the moral outrage about the border, you see the coverage really changes. If you turn on MSNBC, particularly back in the day when they were looking at the caravan, the infamous caravan that was coming up from Mexico, MSNBC was constantly talking about how these were women and children escaping violence in Guatemala and what have you. Whereas Fox News was focusing on the fact that actually these are men who are looking for employment. and what have you. But you had two very, very different stories. Fox News would give you all the information about the dangers of sanctuary cities and all this kind of thing, whereas you would hear very little of that on stations like MSNBC. So you see how this kind of divides up differently. And as you look at the different channels. NPR is another good example. Really great reporting on NPR. But NPR tends to choose issues and frame issues from the standpoint of the people who are the victims much of the time. And they don't think that this is a political thing. It's just how they tend to see the world. If you listen to JPR all day long, you're going to hear all these stories constantly about victims all around the world and what have you. So there are these differences. It has to do with how issues are framed and presented. The other thing is what's called the availability bias. And that is the tendency to make inferences based on the ease with which things come to mind, what we remember. There's this idea of cognitive ease that we looked at. I think in the
intro night.
The intro night we played that film about the illusion of truth. Talked about the problem of cognitive ease, that we tend to go for things that are easier on our cognition, and this is what the availability bias is grounded in. It's kind of what we remember, the information that is available to us. If somebody asks a question about something, we tend to scan our brain about all the things that we remember. Of course, we don't know everything. We don't have a broad degree of knowledge generally. We tend to have a very small amount of information that we have about it, the available information, and we make decisions based upon what is available to us, what we remember. And of course, this is why propaganda tends to rely a lot on repetition. You say something over and over and over and over again. That becomes easy for people to remember, and people will naturally kind of gravitate towards believing the things that are easy to remember. So it's this idea of the availability bias, the tendency to make inferences based on the ease with which things come to mind. So you're watching Fox News. It's 2016. It's the presidential election. Everybody's geared up. What's Fox News doing? They're talking about the Muslim terrorists, and they're talking about the immigrants that are coming across the border and killing people. So you're getting these messages all the time, over and over again. You think, oh my God, the world's going to hell. We're going to be invaded by Islamist terrorists any minute now. So this is the effect of the news when they tend to focus on things over and over and over again, the repetition. And the thing you have to remember is that the news, by definition, is all the bad news that's fit to print. We tend to, we don't get the things that don't happen. We hear about the murders and the rapes and the coups and all the terrible things that happen in the world. We think about all the environmental disasters that happen. We don't tend to look at the positive things. We tend to not see the things that are going really well. The fact that hunger is being alleviated at a massive rate over the course of the last few decades, things like that. And where you really see this, and what I call the biggest bias of all, is that there are a number of books that have come out in the last couple of years that all talk about how when you look at the data about the environment and what have you, and how humans are getting along, the world is getting much, much better. And one of the books that points this out is this book, Factfulness, by Hans Rosling. Maybe some of you know Hans Rosling. And he says, he talks about the importance of factfulness, calibrating our understanding of the world to empirical reality. When you actually measure things, when you look at the data in terms of human wellness, measures of well-being have improved everywhere in the world. On a grand scale, things are getting much, much better. And yet people tend to not believe that. In fact, he does a wonderful TED Talk where he asks a number of questions. They have, if you've seen the TED Talks, they pass out these little handheld voting machines, and he asks a number of questions that have to do with wellness, like what is hunger being alleviated? Are there more hungry people today than there were 20 years ago, or is poverty? How many more people are in poverty today? And consistently, the chimps who just randomly choose the buttons They have a much better, they predict the answers much better, just randomly hitting them. Humans are really, really bad at predicting how the world is. Because when you look at, yeah, well, and that's the point. That's the point. If all you're getting is bad news, I think this is one of the problems with here in Southern Oregon, because, you know, we have, thank God, we've got wonderful environmentalist groups in Southern Oregon. Southern Oregon is one of these areas in the country that has attracted a lot of people who are concerned about the environment. That's really, really great. The problem is we tend to get stories about degradation and any times there is some story or some report or some analysis that comes online that describes we've got 12 years to live or climate change is going to, those stories get put on the front page of the Daily Tidings and the Mail Tribune. You hear about them on JPR. You don't hear the stories that are more positive, that talk about the fact that, for example, the prevalence of cell phones, the iPhone and what have you, has cut down on the amount of junk that we have in the world. Think about it. What we have on our phones now, we used to have alarm clocks and radios and all the things that the cell phone, you know, mass junk. We are creating less stuff today than we did 20 years ago. We are actually becoming more sustainable. But you will never hear a story like that in the media because the media likes news that is bad. So we have this kind of bias towards thinking that the world is really getting bad. We did last thing I'll say on this, we did a film night last year in Medford about this on the environment to show all the metrics of the environment, you know, how we're actually, America's cleaner today than it was when I was a kid, you know, and a whole measure of, nobody believed it. It was the most controversial talk I think that we had because, again, this availability bias, if all you're hearing is bad news over and over again, you're going to be biased to think that the world is going to end any minute now. So last thing, I want to talk about manipulation a little bit. We'll get into this a little bit more next week because it is a really, you know, there is a tendency for people to think that we're being manipulated by the news. And, you know, some of you may remember subliminal advertising. Back in the 50s and 60s, everybody was convinced that these little subliminal messages in movies. Well, it turns out the studies, you know, were pretty fraudulent on that. It turns out that subliminal advertising had really no effect on people. It's a pretty well-known phenomena. And one of the reasons is quite simple, is that there was this idea in the 1950s and 60s that minds are kind of socially constructed, that everything we are is that we just learn things from we come into the world as kind of blank slates, and the world kind of writes on us, you know, and so what we are is all the product of learning, that we're really manipulated by the environment. And of course, that's kind of the older social science. It's the idea that socialization makes minds, that culture, the environment, parenting, the experience, this is what really makes minds. And the newer science is saying, well, that's not really true. It's actually the other way around, that we tend to come into the world with certain basic instincts, the kinds of things that we've been talking about. And the socialization is a really important component, but it's not the main driver of human experience. In fact, parenting is a great example. The role of parenting is actually not particularly robust in making kids successful. What actually makes kids more successful is the influence of their peer groups and the influence of their genes. Those are things that really have more to do with, you know, with making people who they are. You know, we're not.
Are their peer groups not part of the social culture?
Yeah, they are. They are. Right. But it's less parents. But it really has a lot more to do with the basic genetic drives, which kind of grow out of that. But we'll get back to that in a second because I know it's controversial. But you know, the point is that we're not blank slates. What really tends to drive human cognition are the things I think that we've been talking about that are more basic and natural to us, that arise from us.
What we're wired for.
Yeah, we're pre-wired for certain things, and that's what's really critical. And it's the things, it's the biases that we've been talking about that really have much more to do with how we filter information than what's actually coming to us. You know, it's kind of like this idea that the reason why people like Big Macs is not because there's a Big Mac store on the corner. There's a Big Mac store on the corner because people like Big Macs. It's kind of getting the cart before the horse. Both are important. Both are part of the process. But it really is more about, it's more about our operating systems that cause us to look at the world the way that we do. Because again, just a reminder, humans are feeling machines that think. Advertisers know this. Ads appeal to our feelings, not our thinking. That's more the dynamic that's at play. So you have to, the old saying, caveat emptor, the buyer beware. When you're going out and you're navigating the world of media and information, be aware that, there are people that are trying to appeal to you, but they're appealing to these natural instincts that are already there. They're not they're not so much imposing things on you. So again, critical thinking, a big takeaway, question your feelings. Question your feelings. If you're concerned about manipulation, be aware that advertisers, news agencies, like Lori was saying, the news is really pumped up right now to make you angry about Donald Trump or be angry about the people who are angry about Donald Trump. There's a lot of money to be made in the Trump resistance. There's a lot of money to be made in the Trump defense right now online. Be aware of that and try not to take a side. Try to stay out of that and just be rational. You can not like Trump, you can like Trump, but try and stay out of the moral outrage and kind of be more mindful and critical in your thinking. Okay.
Okay. Q&A and discussion. Floor is open.
On that topic of the advertising, the emotional thing, there is a huge amount of influence on us from advertising and marketing. And it almost felt like you were just lumping that as only intellectual, but it's this emotional input. Edward Bernays? Yeah, he was the nephew of Freud.
Right.
And
he was the German and propagandist.
He's who is the father of our
Mass
Western
media.
marketing.
Yep.
And he's singly responsible for it. And the only thing he ever regretted was getting women to smoke. The whole campaign to get women to smoke was designed by him. And he was the toast of the town in Manhattan.
But it could have been smoking. It could have been any other thing.
He did. That was the only thing he regretted.
Right.
But that's an example of
Right.
how powerful he was. He toppled countries,
Yeah.
governments in other countries with the kind of marketing that he devised. And it was all designed to hook the emotions.
That's right.
When Freud said, if we have these innate drives, there's an access into people because if we can build, and this is what our marketing is designed for, is if we can build an insecurity and a need in people, then we will produce what will ameliorate that.
I would say dependence. The need is already there. That's the innate drive.
Yeah, out of the innate drive,
Right.
they will
shape it.
construct a deficiency in that.
Or a survival trigger.
Right,
Exactly.
exactly.
I mean, deep
Exactly.
down, and that
And then
goes
you're
back to the
driven
beginning.
to relieve that anxiety.
Right.
And so that's what is to watch for. And there's still a lot of money put into this subliminal stuff. I'll try to remember to bring it next time. I used it in a talk. This is a full page ad in a magazine for Pantene shampoo. Here's all these, it's like it's being tossed out, and there's all these bubbles and splashes of this product, and there's a breast in it. And it's just as clear as can be. And I held it up, and some people just couldn't see a thing, and other people went, oh! And so there it is. If you see it, you see it. But
So the
there's that
message-
sexual pull.
The message of that would be?
The studies have shown that anything that has to do with sexuality or any of these drives, especially that are where you feel have insecurity, especially with sexuality though, if you have an image embedded, there's a video on that, we have it here in the library. Anything sexual will draw your eyes, and you will pay more attention to it.
Right,
That's
particularly
true
men,
whether-
because
particularly
men react to appearance.
Yes.
Sexual fertility signs like lipstick and blush and
Yes.
high. Why do we have women wear high heels? Because it
Right.
accentuates the buttocks. That
That's
makes
right.
women more sexually
And the
exactly.
legs look longer.
But those are all.
But
But again, it's building on natural drives and
Yes.
manipulating people
Yes.
based upon those natural drives.
But if we're not aware of our natural drives, we're not aware of that's happening, then we're just the cork in the water.
But does it need to be subliminal? Because we sell cars that way, everything, seems like everything in our society is sold through sex or through
But
that kind
if
of.
you can see, you say, oh, they're just trying to pull me with sex there,
Uh-huh.
and you'll dismiss the ad. It's when our brains, our lower brains, our perceptual brains will pick that stuff up, and the conscious brain won't.
So it would lead somebody to buy Pantene shampoo because.
It would attract their attention to the ad, and then you can convince yourself.
I remember those studies that you were talking about, and I really, even then, but in one of my college classes, we looked at those, and it was like, we were looking at whether or not those were really making a difference in people's subconscious.
Well, then the next question is, are they still putting money into it? And the answer is yes.
And the question
You'll have
too
to
is,
Sorry.
no, are they as powerful as what we're thinking they are? Or people are just going to, I mean, if I see a car and I want to buy it, somebody wants to buy a car because some sexy gal is standing right next to the car.
Mhm.
Okay, that's their choice, but they're buying the product with their own knowledge of,
So these major corporations spend millions and millions of dollars on marketing research. And if they're still putting money into those kinds of ads, I would venture to guess that they still.
Well, that's what I mean by subliminal advertising is the idea that you could put these really fast frames
Right,
into
exactly.
those,
That's
and that kind of stuff has been shown to be not effective. But what you're talking about is advertisers using our instincts
Yes.
to draw us to one product versus another, or to form those kinds of.
And much of this is actually subliminal. It's not the words flashed on the screen.
Right,
in the early days.
well, it's subconscious.
But it's still subconscious.
Right, it's beneath the threshold.
Subliminal, it's
Below the
perception.
threshold of consciousness.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Good point.
But men don't buy Pantene, women
that's
do.
what,
So
Even women's attention is drawn to sexual things. They will also bury a penis in advertising, especially in alcohol advertising. But it will actually affect a woman's perspective too.
Well, the way that you would appeal to
Partly
the way
it's
that you would
not-
appeal to a woman, though, is by emphasizing high status. And
Yes, that is-
because
yes.
women go for status, men go for the appearance of beauty because males want signs of
They also want
fertility.
status. I think that'll work for both genders.
No, I'm saying is that for women, status is more important because women biologically want to find a male that's going to take care of them in the biological world. I don't mean in the patriarchy way, but if you are, that's how a female is concerned about choice, mate choice. They want a partner that's going to make sure it's going to protect their young and what have you.
Right.
It's one of the differences between women and men, which is why you will always see the Donald Trump with the high status kind of. No, I'm not going to go there.
Yeah.
What I'm suggesting is that status, when you go to the biological level, for women that status would be to attract a higher status male.
Exactly.
But it's also
That's why
very important
advertising for a
males to attract a more beautiful woman.
Right, because for a man, that's a sign of status, having a beautiful woman next to him.
Exactly.
And a woman wants status because she wants to make sure that there is a mate there that's going to protect and provide for the young. That's not a cultural construct, that's a
There's the
biological.
basis for it, and it gets used.
And it's not just Homo sapiens.
Is
Yeah.
right. No, it's
Totally.
Totally.
just always think
Is that stereotyping?
No, no, it's not. But stereotypes do tend to stand up, and that's driven in just basic biology as a species. That's the way males and females
marketing
are.
takes advantage of it.
Totally.
And the marketing then helps stereotype.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Jeff had a question or
Well,
comment.
comment more, I think. As I understand it, as children, there's vast amounts of data coming in, which we learn to filter and decide what's important and what's not important. And then our filters change as we go through life. We become more interested in members of the opposite sex when we're, say, in puberty, more interested in job opportunities in our 20s, whatever. And we can be surrounded by data that we simply don't perceive. It falls below our threshold of attention. I think partly what you're describing with the media is they are, if we use that attention threshold as part of our iOS, they're literally hacking our iOS by saying, hey, you should pay attention to this thing. We're going to reprogram your reticular activating system so that you engage and see these things as threats. What? People coming up from the southern border? Who cares? Oh no, they're coming up to steal your jobs, to do bad things to your women. They're probably going to steal the hubcaps off your car, whatever. So, and I think left-leaning media is going to hack your reticular activating system to look for certain things. The right side is going to hack it in a different way. But of course, what do our filters always allow in? Threats. So, of course, they're going to tell us the bad news, because the bad news will engage and pay attention. And the whole point of news is to do what? It's to sell advertising. So the advertisers want to engage us. So.
In money.
Really well said. That's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
My husband was a real Fox News watcher, and he started out as a fairly progressive person, and the more conservative news he watched, the more conservative and the more angry he became. And we would have like real discussions that turned into arguments about this. And I said, you don't believe you're being manipulated? Oh no, you're being manipulated. So, okay, turn off the sound, turn off the volume, and just watch the television with no sound. And tell me what you see on when you're watching like Rush, when you're watching Hannity, when you're watching all these people. And it's if you do it with anything, just turn off the volume and watch the expressions, and you will respond. It's not the words you're hearing; it's the emotion you're responding to, and that's how they really hook you.
And I think that's the point of Matt Taibbi's new book that's coming out. It's
What's it called? The
Hate Inc.
Hate Inc. Yeah. And what's really sad, because my dad, it's interesting, and I have the same experience only with my dad. He's a Rachel Maddow lover. And she's brilliant, no doubt. But, it should be pretty clear to most people that, with the Mueller thing, that they kind of went way too far. And of course, Matt Taibbi is one of the people that has written about that, that they've done the same kind of thing that Fox News has been doing for a long time. It's just that now it's the people on the left that are getting it. So we're really getting it from both sides, but it's the same kind of experience. And I have the same conversation with my dad all the time, even though I'm very progressive. I'm like, Dad, you realize this is basically propaganda.
Yeah.
Unless I keep saying, watch Bret Baier on Fox, because, get a little balance, in there.
Turn them both down.
Nikki, you had a question, and then we're at 9 o'clock.
Okay, just quick. I'm thinking about the difference between, the left and the right, and, I sitting there thinking, well, yeah, I care about victims, fairness, equality, all those things. That's the hallmark of the left, and I really am not that into authority and those things on the right, and I don't want to be, it's just not who I am, and yet I'm not going to go toe-to-toe with anybody on my beliefs or anything. So what, is it just to know that somebody else has those other viewpoints? What's the purpose of...
Could I maybe jump in here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. That actually speaks right to what I was hoping to say, which is that, as you were talking, I was thinking all these media outlets that are biased, sure, completely believe that. I think the New New York Times is very left-leaning. But to me, I was like, but what about those great podcasts that like seem so even-keeled, and they're just these like, you know, like Invisibilia or whatever you listen to, right? That's like, they seem like they're just these explorations of human nature and explorations of like what it means to be empathetic and what it means to be a citizen in this world. And I realized as you were speaking, like those things though, they, like you mentioned with framing, right? They're framed with this idea of like the things we should be talking about are based around empathy and morality. Whereas you could probably have, there's probably a whole bunch of podcasts, like something that came to mind was like, there's probably these podcasts that, you know, about police, right? About like police doing good work in cities, right?
Blue Lives Matter.
Like, what?
Blue Lives Matter is an example of that, yeah.
Yeah, so like podcasts that to someone on the right, they probably think like this isn't a biased podcast,
Right.
but it has this frame of, you know, we should talk about things that are important to the world, like authority. So maybe to answer your question, like rather than jumping to like, well, we just have to listen to Fox News, like they're too far gone, and the New York Times is too far gone for a conservative, right? But maybe if we can like listen to these sort of like less political but still like framed in moral discussions, these podcasts and things like that are in the middle, where you can listen and say, you know, they're not saying that like we should vote for Donald Trump. They're just telling a story about a police officer who did a good thing, right? And that can like move us toward this place of understanding why is a moral issue around authority something that is worth considering and weaving into our own moral framework about the world.
Great point.
Great.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah. And I do want to bring up one more thing that's really helped me change, to see both sides, is that it's kind of an irony that one of the reasons so many people want to come to the United States is something called rule of law, which their countries don't have. You may not agree with all the laws here, and of course there's corruption, but then when you have things, and I'm not taking a side here, but then when you have cities saying, I'm going against federal law, we're going to be sanctuary cities, they're breaking the law though. So it's a weird thing that, and as I broaden my perspective, I see what's good about some respect for authority and patriotism and things like that, because the left tends to be unpatriotic. And in bridging, we feel like people need to come together as Americans.
They're low in loyalty.
And I've had to deal with my own aversion to the American flag, and now I'm thinking, no. After hearing people, this one Iranian guy came to one of our talks on free speech. He said he had fled his country 5 years ago. He says, you do not understand how lucky you are to have the First and the Second Amendments. And there was something that snapped in me, and I thought, I need to really broaden my vision here. So. But that was a great example you gave, Ari.
And just to, shout out, I personally get my news a lot from YouTube. I find independent journalists, that's how I discovered what was really going on at the border, that it really was. I mean, in this case, Fox News tended to get it right about what was happening at the border, that in fact we have a large number of people who are coming here because of economics. They weren't really fleeing, but the media was focusing on the women and the children in the middle of the camps when there were all these men. But the only way to do that is to get a journalist who says, wait a second, let's pull the camera back, and let's look and see what's really going on here. And there's a great movement of people on YouTube for independent journalists who take their cameras to places and they don't edit it a lot and they just show you what's going on. And I find they tend to be more balanced because they don't really have a dog in the fight. They're not trying to sell you something. They really are independent and trying to provide, just good information.
Tim Pool is a great one. Do you know Tim Pool, Ari? He is left-leaning. He's on the left, but he's wants the truth
Yeah.
more than, defending his side.
And you know,
So-
and a lot of these independent reporters are real honest about their politics, and I would rather have. That's one of the things I like about The Economist is The Economist will tell you kind of where they're coming. They'll give you the facts, and then they'll say, "This is our opinion." And so much journalism today, you read the Washington Post, particularly I've noticed, it's opinion laid right in with the reporting. I see that locally in our local newspapers. There's opinions constantly being, things are stated as factual that are not actually factual when you examine them. And so, those are the kinds of things I think you have to be aware of.
Is there another, do you have any suggestions on how to find more of these independent reporters?
No, but that would be a good thing for me to come up with.
That would be great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Every time you see one, if you make a list,
I've got
send it to me. I will make a list. Yeah. It's after 9, so sorry we ran a little over.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you for my
Thanks
cake.
for being a great group.
Oh, what a
and,
great group you guys are. Really, really fun. You too, Ari, even though you're not here. So we'll see you next week. Good. And you can get your diploma.